Hector Birchwood of Celtic Research at times has to juggle the roles of case manager, researcher and, if necessary, traveller. Hector also relies on certificates to move his research on, as happened with the case of Kenneth Yale. Kenneth Yale died in a Glasgow hospital aged 79, leaving no will and an estate of £12,000. The search to try and find his heirs led to the discovery of a skeleton in the Yale family closet. Patricia Fleming is a staff nurse at the Orchards Hospital in Glasgow.
Kenny was very much old school gent, would speak quite fond of his time in the services. Came from a family of servicemen, I believe his father and his grandfather also, and quite a few very close relationships with patients that have already been in the services equally for long periods of time. So liked the old familiar.
Kenneth never married and had no apparent family.
Kenny never had any visitors as such. There's a befriending service and also the chaplain, the hospital chaplain, and those were the only people other than ward staff that Kenny had contact with.
Hector took up Kenneth's case. With only a name and a hospital address to go on, Hector's starting point was to find Kenneth's birth certificate to get his parents' details.
Well, the first hurdle we had on this case was not being able to find a birth certificate for the deceased in Scotland. Yale isn't really a particularly Scottish name. There are people with the name Yale in Scotland, but it's not something that I would think is necessarily a Scottish name. And that's one of the reasons why I thought that the research should continue in England.
Hector traced Kenneth's birth certificate to London. The certificate showed that Kenneth's father, James Sinclair Madron Yale, was a solicitor and had married a Grace Turbot. But this wasn't his first marriage.
When we discovered that James Sinclair Yale had been previously married, we then went through the next stage, which is trying to see if he had any children from that marriage. He had one son, also called James. He died very young, but we did find that he had children, and that eventually developed into us finding an heir.
Kenneth's father, James, had a son from a previous marriage, Kenneth's half-brother. Hector's research showed that Kenneth's half-brother had a daughter. As his only living heir, she was entitled to his £12,000 estate.
It was quite a surprise, disbelief, really. And it was very, very strange to know there was somebody that had obviously been relatively close genetically to me that I'd never known existed. So it was a very strange feeling. Nice to be inheriting something, but very sad to have not ever known the person that had left it for me. I think I can 100% say that my father did not know he had a half-brother. He'd known that his father was a solicitor or a barrister in London, and obviously that they had divorced when my father was very, very young. There was no contact between my father and his father following that.
Hector is on his way over to Sonia's with the results of his latest research.
I managed to get the divorce papers relating to the grandparents of our heir, and I think she will probably find some of the information that we've uncovered rather surprising.
As well as her grandparents' divorce papers, Hector has bought all the birth, marriage and death certificates used to connect Sonia to her half-uncle, Kenneth.
That's the marriage of your grandparents.
Ah, right.
So here we have James Sinclair with Louise Parsons. They're only a year apart. He's,
they were quite young, weren't they?
They were quite young, 22 and 21 years old. And this is relating to the divorce papers for your grandparents. There are a few surprising facts here from what you already know. The petition was filed on 14th of May 1926. 6 months later, the decree nisi was awarded. The second marriage of James Sinclair indicates that maybe he was the party who divorced your grandmother. But if you look at the divorce proceedings and who is actually putting together the petition, the petitioner is Louise Yale.
Before the 1920s, it was uncommon for wives to petition for divorce because women had to prove more grounds than men. However, after a change in law in 1923, divorce for women was more accessible.
There was an important change in the law in 1923. Prior to that, a wife couldn't divorce her husband on the basis of his adultery alone. She had to prove, in addition, cruelty, desertion for 2 years, or incest, bigamy, sodomy, bestiality, or rape. After 1923, she could petition on the basis of adultery alone.
At this time, you had to find a fault, a reason to divorce somebody. There was no such thing as a no-fault divorce, and normally adultery was the reason.
The impression I got was that perhaps my grandfather wasn't the best husband in the world, and I think possibly adultery might be in there, just from recollection of conversations I sort of overheard.
Well, you are right. Adultery does play a part in this. Maybe not just adultery with one person.
Oh dear.
Possibly with many. I'll just turn your attention quite quickly to paragraph 5 of the affidavit, where the respondent has frequently committed adultery with women whose names are unknown to your petitioner.
Right.
While Sonia's grandparents were waiting for the divorce to come through, her grandfather quickly moved on to a new relationship.
He did marry again quite quickly then, didn't he?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Didn't waste time.
Very quickly, because Kenneth was born in 27. And he didn't hang about.
1927. So that's June 1927, so less than a year after the divorce was granted.
Kenneth's mother was not married to Sonia's grandfather when she conceived, and there was still considerable social stigma attached to being an illegitimate child.
Well, the timing of the divorce would have been quite crucial. The law had changed at the start of 1927 to allow a child to be legitimated by a subsequent marriage. However, that only applied if neither of the parents was married to a third party at the time of the child's birth.
The divorce timing worked out for Kenneth, and his parents were married just 16 days before he was born. Because Sonia's grandfather successfully managed to keep his two children apart for their entire lives, Sonia knows very few details about her half-uncle Kenneth. There are no surviving photos of him, so she doesn't even know what he looks like.